So first, okay, so 4 announcements, none too detailed. First, the final paper. Second, midterm grading. Third, office hours. Fourth, the readings. So in that order, the final paper, I will repost the details from the earlier announcement, but it is due the last class session, which is March 30th. So in advance of 6 p.m. Tuesday, March 30th. And so it can be either an individual or a paired or a team paper, up to 5 students. Anticipated length about 10 pages, and precise length not as important as much as good, thoughtful coverage of management, leadership, strategic analysis with applicability to course materials. Again, I'll post the details. Office hours, either the scheduled sessions or by appointment, could be good opportunities to discuss possible topics with Professor Teece. More on that in a sec. Second, midterm grading. So again, thank you for the midterms. I will be compiling them for Professor Teece, so we will have a lot to get through, and that's a good thing. Thank you for all of the contributions you put into that. Third, office hours tomorrow and on the 17th. There are still some sessions available in the group sessions from 2:30 to 3:30, again tomorrow and on the 17th. See the Google Sheet as posted earlier. I'll repost the link as well. And again, you can also schedule by appointment. That's third, final midterm, and the office hours. Fourth, readings for next week have been posted in the courses. So you should be set with those. And with that, Professor Teece, I think we can return to lecture.
Thank you, Ian. Before I move on, I just want to pause to see if there's any reflections on what Professor O'Reilly had to say. There's so many jewels in what he said. You're probably still digesting them as I am, but I wonder if we've got a few comments from some of you about many of the provocative things that he said. Anyone? You all had 15 minutes to think about it. Adam, David, Andrew, anyone want to say anything?
Yeah, Professor, I guess just one comment from my side. It was interesting, like while he was kind of talking about everything, this kind of dawned on me. I actually, before my current position, worked at a company called Casper. We were like the e-commerce mattress company, and it was headquartered in New York, but our product design office is, well, it was in San Francisco. I left in October, and shortly after that, I found out that the product design office out here was closed. But basically, we were charged with kind of doing all these innovative products, designing all these innovative products for the company, and we were kind of left on our own out here in San Francisco to, kind of, design these innovative products, come up with interesting things, and then kind of pitch them to our New York office, who would then kind of scale them, do all the marketing and advertising. So it's kind of interesting hearing all the things he said, and then kind of realize I was kind of part of an organization that was doing those things, and then it was eventually shut down by the company because they did kind of switch and start to focus on, efficiency and cost savings and all of those things. So just kind of interesting to reflect on that experience.
Right. The ordinary capabilities drive out the dynamic once more. Yeah, and but to be fair to the CFOs, I mean, it's one thing to encourage incubation because it's relatively low cost, but then when it gets to scale up, depending on the product, it's high cost. The great thing, of course, about e-commerce is, and what Google and others do, creating new products is not often high cost, it's relatively low cost. So that sort of characteristic of traditional innovation has sort of gone away. I mean, and you can experiment, you can change the way you do things, and you get immediate real-time feedback. So I think he's right to say that incubation is the easy part and scaling up is the hard part. But at the same time, I don't think it's, it's not a one-size-fits-all problem. All right, well, look, keep reflecting on these things. I mean, I don't expect you to necessarily digest all of this at once. These things are incremental. You have to think about it and reflect on it, and you can go back and listen to the class again, as I trust you will. And as we go forward through looking at these other related paradigms, which is what I'm going to do now, we'll have chance again to discuss what Professor O'Reilly had to say. So here's a list of some of the alternative paradigms in addition to ambidexterity that we're going to look at in the next today's class and next class. And the first one is disruption, which of course made Clay Christensen famous. Clay wrote this book and Bill Gates read it and said, gee, what a great book this is. And then the whole world knew about disruption, even though the idea has been in the literature for at least 100 years. But Clay modernized it and talked about some Silicon Valley stories. And that's why it caught on. But let's explore a little bit more about what the framework is all about. And sadly, he passed away earlier this year. He's still a very young man, so it's and he truly was a gentleman and a scholar and a very kind and nice and polite person. So it's a tragedy when you lose somebody like that. But his basic idea of disruption is actually fairly limited. And I want you to be thinking hard about experiences you've had and circumstances when you look at this. So according to Clay, disruption is a process where a smaller company with few resources successfully challenges an incumbent. It's not when one incumbent challenges another incumbent. It's not when an incumbent challenges a small company. The pattern that he's focused on, and which he claims is the one that's the most dangerous, and he's probably right, is where the small company with few resources successfully challenges an incumbent. And as we know, incumbents can be vulnerable because they focus on this incremental improvement, and they get blindsided. So indirectly, he's saying that companies are not rational, that companies are myopic, that managers are myopic. Because if you're ever blindsided, it means that, it's implicitly saying there's a cognitive failure of some kind. You're not seeing what you should see. And, we should ask, well, why is that true? And if somebody points out that managers have these deficiencies and business schools start teaching them about how not to be blindsided, why do companies continue to be blindsided? Is it because we're doing a poor job of instruction, or because there's some inherent flaw in human behavior that causes this phenomenon? And so let's see what the trajectory is that he has in mind. It says it's new entrants get traction at the lower end and they move up market. So let's think about some cases where that's true. And when they move up market, the mainstream customers start adopting the products, and then suddenly the incumbent firm finds out they're losing market share. And it's only when they start losing market share that they wake up. And of course, this does fit many stories. It's, workstations blowing away mini computers and workstations blowing away mainframe computers. It's And the classic one in the business school textbooks 20 years ago was Honda coming in to the motorcycle industry with a Honda 50. There's still a Honda 50 out there. In fact, I used to own one. I might buy another one. But the Honda 50 was an entry-level bike, and of course, in the end, they're making the Honda 500s and Honda 1500s, and completely blew away the European manufacturers, particularly the British motorcycle industry, crumbled with Honda and then Suzuki and Yamaha behind them. And unquestionably, they didn't come in with a big bike and go down towards little bikes. They began at the bottom with a little bike and ended up as a big bike. But what's to say, is there an iron rule here? Why couldn't Honda have come in with a big bike and then scaled it down to a little bike? Is that theoretically possible? Yes. Is that also a possible strategic trajectory? Yes. But, you know, we can talk about why it's not such an easy thing to do as it is to start at the bottom and work up. So, so this is his basic framework, that it starts at the bottom, you move up, but under this definition of disruption, is Uber a disruptor? Is Tesla a disruptor? Tesla actually came in with a pretty moderately priced car. They didn't come in with a cheap, boxy, low-powered, struggling battery car that then gradually moved the way up. I mean, they started in the middle of the market, maybe closer to the top of the market, and now they're moving down. So doesn't fit Christensen's model. So let's just stop here for a moment and discuss other examples that may come to mind of companies that start at the top and move down. I mean, is Rolls-Royce ever going to make a Volkswagen or a low-cost economy car? I wouldn't think so, but there's a branding reason for that. But can you think of examples of companies that had started at the top and gone down? Apple's flirted with it with a somewhat lower cost iPhone. And in fact, all the guys on Wall Street tell them that that's what they should do. But Tim Cook and Steve Jobs before him have resisted that temptation. Why? What's the magic from starting at the bottom and going up versus starting at the top and coming down? Is there any magic to it? Andrew, what about banking? Can you start in high-end personal banking and work your way down into mass market banking?
I mean, I would imagine so. I think that the underlying element of this where it ties into dynamic capabilities is that you're able to take an innovative idea and transform it into a profitable business model to then sustain a broader market offering. And so I think about, what Wealthfront is doing, charging 0.25% APR for, robo management of portfolios, and how the big players in the industry like a Wells Fargo or a Citi may or may not be missing out on that, and what kind of, shifts in the market that's causing.
Yeah. So give me some of the high-end banks out there. What's the one out here in San Francisco that's high-end personal banks that are sort of niche players? Can they ever become big mass market players in your mind, or are they stuck as a niche player forever?
That's an interesting question. I would put on my other banker hat and say this might be an opportunity where a well-disciplined M&A strategy for a bank could see that opportunity to, acquire those assets to then extend those offerings to a broader audience. But I don't think independently, no, because the challenge with a lot of this like mass market consumer challenge is to what extent can you reach that wider audience cheaply and efficiently? if it's a social network like Facebook, you get that, what they call the flywheel, going pretty quickly. Whereas I would imagine that's kind of the challenge going from high end down.
Well, yeah, and let's take the business that I'm in here. I'm sitting in the Berkeley Research Group. We're kind of high end to high price consulting. We can't do low cost jobs. And if we tried to, you could take our brand. It would hurt the brand to move it from a high end brand to a low end brand. You damage the brand. But secondly, the culture, the way in which you manage high end talent. And less well-educated and less specialized talent, it's actually quite different as well. So there are brand reasons, there are cultural reasons, but why is it possible to go the other way? Or, I mean, isn't it possible to go anyway? I mean, is Christensen right that the only form of disruption is to start at the bottom and move up? I mean, surely Tesla is disruptive to the auto industry, but not by Christensen's definition. What was the price of the first Tesla? Does anyone know? About 40 or 50 grand, isn't that right? I don't know. Does anyone own a Tesla that's in the class? And then there's two models of Tesla, if I remember right. Both of them are pretty high end, but it's been very disruptive across. Well, not so much disruptive yet in terms of the market share, because they don't have a lot, but it's potentially very disruptive, not just at the high end, but elsewhere as well. Anyway, the point is that Christensen claims that the disruption to worry about is from the bottom up. I want you to think about that and figure whether that's a generalizable principle, and whether you can therefore take comfort if you're at the low end. You don't have to worry about the big guys coming after your lunch. So really what he's saying is that the sensing function of the enterprise is weak, because disruption can take time. Incumbents frequently overlook this competition. It's the old story of the frog in the pot. The frog doesn't know that it's being cooked until it's too late. But why should that be so? And if you have strong dynamic capabilities, isn't that an antidote? I mean, I'll give you that to think about here, because he's saying that there's a degree of lack of alertness. Is a degree of lack of paranoia, to paraphrase Andy Grove from Intel, that if you're letting this phenomena happen, you're not alert, you're not sensing, you're not making sense of the competitive developments of the marketplace. So another way of saying what Christensen is saying is, if you've got weak dynamic capabilities, particularly with respect to sensing and sense making, you're vulnerable. We would agree. So what I see is that what Christensen is doing is saying, beef up your dynamic capabilities. He's also implicitly assuming that managers make decision errors all the time, that they're blindsided, and I think another element that he does suggest is that frequently, if you come up from the bottom, you're using also a different business model. Although Honda, when it came into the motorcycle business, wasn't doing anything different. It was just selling a low-cost bike. But it went from the Honda 50 to the Honda 75cc to the Honda 150 to the Honda 250 to the Honda 350 to the Honda 650, and then I forget what happened after that. And Suzuki did more or less the same thing. So this is actually a chart from Christensen. And I think the way we're supposed to read this chart is you've got the market segmented between low end, mainstream, and high end. And what he's got is the entrance coming in from the low end and moving up. The incumbent sustaining strategy, or the way out of it for the incumbent, is to increase the slope of the line. That's what Christensen's telling us. Because if you take off that second red line there, if you take off the incumbent sustaining trajectory, then what this diagram tells you is that the entrant will take the low end, then the mainstream, then the high end. So it's putting pressure from below on the incumbent to up their game and stay ahead. But this is the very essence of Christensen. It's quite amazing that this idea got so much traction, built on such a, I wouldn't say flimsy, but yeah, I will say flimsy, pretty flimsy foundation, that strategy takes this particular regularity and no other. So here are the questions that we can put to Professor Christensen. Sadly, he's not around to answer them, but probably somewhere out there, if you go through all the interviews of him, I'm sure that someone else has put these questions to him. It'll be a good exercise to go check. You know, as I've said, it's not just a matter of bottom up, it can also be top down. And various other people have noted that competition comes not just in this way, it comes in many different ways. Silicon Valley startups contributed to the troubles of IBM, it was RCA, it was Kodak, it was Motorola, that in fact competition is much more variegated. If you believe Christensen that that's the only thing you have to worry about, you'll always be looking, you know, for who the low-cost provider is, that while you're looking for who the low-cost competitor is, you could get hit some other way as well. Now, as we've said, that what he's really saying is there's a weakness here on the cognitive side, what we would call a lack of dynamic capabilities, not just in sensing, but also in seizing, perhaps also in transforming. Other people have noted that Christensen, you know, is not necessarily correct in the examples that he's used. You know, when you get to be such a big target as Professor Christensen did, people start checking his cases and so forth, and a lot of people are actually critical of his diagnosis of why certain companies failed. And that's what this slide is about. This is all in the readings, and you'll eventually get to it. So to summarize, what I would say is that the essence of Christensen's theory is that managers make decision areas, they miss market transitions because they are smitten by established customers. So here is, when you dig deeper, here is his story. The companies like IBM, or any company, will talk to the customers they have and not the customers they don't have. And they won't often talk to the customers they lose, that they're dialoguing with their customers all the time, and what they should be dialoguing with, and not the customers they have, but the customers they don't have. And this is the source of the failure. It's sort of, another way of putting it in statistical terms, it's sampling error by managers. You know, they haven't taken a basic course in statistics, and they're jumping to conclusions based on information they're getting from their existing customers. But what they should be basing their decisions on is information from customers they've lost and from customers that they've never won in the first place. So let me ask you, how many of you in your companies have a process whereby, you know, if you lose a customer, you try and figure out why? Clearly, if it's a big win, it's probably the case. You know, if you're in a bidding market where you're bidding for a big contract, it probably comes naturally. But, you know, when you've got thousands and hundreds of thousands of customers, do you have the processes in place? Or do you know companies that have the processes in place to find where they to figure out why they lose customers. Adam, any thoughts on that? Anybody else?
Or anyone who hasn't chimed in yet.
Sorry, Ian, I didn't hear that.
Oh, opening up to anyone else who hasn't chimed in
Okay.
yet.
I can go. I work for a consumer tech company, and I know that our research team does a lot of work on our growth accounting funnel. So they look at new, churned, resurrected users, and they sample each of those groups and interview them, and they do, I don't know how frequent, but semi-periodic reports on their findings from talking to those folks.
Well, that's good to hear. You know, I think companies do it sporadically. I mean, if I look at the Berkeley Research Group, do we do it systematically? No, we do have a chief revenue officer whose job is to figure out why we're not winning business that we don't have. But and we systematically go through and look at the, you know, who are the potential customers that we have, and why don't we ask the question, why don't we have those clients, and we organize systematically to go after the clients we don't have, which is sort of a natural thing in marketing, I suppose. But anyway, this is part of the Clay Christensen story, is that you get blindsided by the customers you have, and you don't pay enough attention to the customers you don't have. And your information flow and your understanding of the markets comes from the customers you have. And so IBM was losing a lot of people to workstation. They were losing mainframe customers to the workstation business, probably at the margin. They were probably holding on to some accounts, but they were losing share in those accounts and didn't necessarily know it until it was too late. And interestingly, for those of you that have curiosity about this, Christensen did write a book called The Innovator's Solution. So after he had gotten all of this attention about the innovator's dilemma, he wrote this book, The Innovator's Solution. And here it's a very thin book, I might point out, but here are some of the things he says that you're supposed to do to avoid the innovator's dilemma. One, you're supposed to target not existing customers, but customers you don't have. Two, never target an incumbent with an incremental solution. Three, look outward, not inward. Don't get infatuated with core competences. Favor emergent strategies over deliberate strategies. Emergent strategies are less formal and more flexible. So stay flexible, adjust to the circumstance, hire people who are fast learners, and be patient. I mean, this is pretty weak tea. It's not very profound stuff. Of course, we would agree with it all, and I think all of that is encompassed by dynamic capabilities. As I said before, I think the solution to the dilemma, what he calls the innovative solution, is to strengthen your dynamic capabilities. Anyway, I'd be curious. Some of you can probably read that book in about 3 hours and buy it online at Amazon. And once again, it sold thousands and thousands of copies, but I think it's weak tea. So let me just stop there with dear Professor Christensen and the innovator's dilemma and disruption, which, you know, give him credit. He popularized the word disruption. Every business, well, not just every MBA student, but just about everybody in the world talks about disruption. And he popularized that word. You know, we used to just say competition. Now we say disruption, because much competition is disruptive. It always has been. But he's changed our vocabulary. So, you know, hopefully there's something more we can learn other than just changing our vocabulary. Well, let me bash on. because this ties in very nicely with what Charles O'Reilly was saying. You know, there's this whole lean startup methodology out there. And by the way, you know, I referenced the book there, The Lean Startup Crown Business by Eric Ries. So these two guys, Steve Blank, who's an adjunct here at Berkeley, and I think he's an adjunct at Stanford Business School too, but he really came up with this idea of the lean startup. You know, it's sort of a bastardization of the lean manufacturing concept. You know, lean manufacturing was what Japanese companies did, which is to do things very efficiently through just in time and so forth. It's I'm not sure it's the best way to describe what this model is all about, but Eric has become a very famous speaker and sold hundreds of thousands of these books on lean startup. And I just mentioned to you earlier that GE adopted all of this and spent hundreds of millions of dollars on lean startup, and it didn't work. And Jeff Immelt was one of the reasons he got fired, according to Professor O'Reilly. What is lean startup? It's an approach to entrepreneurship and new enterprise development, and I would say both with respect to new enterprises as well as with respect to incumbent ones. The emphasis is on learning. Well, what do we mean by learning? The emphasis is not on planning. The emphasis is on you can't plan, so you start. You know, if in doubt, do. You start and you learn, and then you pivot. You change as you learn, because you can't figure it all out ahead of time. You got to change as you learn. De-emphasizes planning. So here is what Eric Ries says. Now, look at this. I've come to believe that learning is the essential unit of progress for startups. The effort that is not absolutely necessary for learning what customers want can be eliminated. So don't do anything unless you're going to learn something from it. I call this validated learning because it is always demonstrated by positive improvements in the startup's core metric. So coming back to Kathy Eisenhart, this is his simple rule for startups. The simple rule being, don't do anything that's not absolutely necessary for learning what customers want. So focus not on the technology, focus on the customer and satisfying a customer need. This is the essence of this framework, and it's what big companies concerned about Christensen's disruption. They don't turn to Christensen to ask what to do. They turn to Steve Blank and Eric Ries, and they turn to Lean Startup, which, by the way, is part of the model that we just heard from Professor O'Reilly, which was the ambidexterity. Yes, a lot of this was about incubation and experimentation. So there's a close affinity here to what Professor O'Reilly was saying, and of course what dynamic capabilities is all about too. So tuning and pivots meshes perfectly well with dynamic capabilities. Ordinary capabilities, however, involve tuning the engine and process of optimization. Tuning is not enough, I guess is what we're saying. Circumstances often require a change in strategy. So tuning, I guess you can tune your strategy, but tuning a strategy is not necessarily an incremental process. It may be a step function. And so that begs the question, what then do entrepreneurial managers do? What are the do's and don'ts? So let's accept the lean startup idea. Let's accept dynamic capabilities. Let's accept ambidexterity. What do you want the managers to do? You don't want them to run around setting marginal revenue equal to marginal cost. I mean, that's what we learn in economics. That's what good management is, setting marginal revenue equal to marginal cost. That's the essence of profit maximization. No one would put that out as a simple rule, not Kathy Eisenhower, not David Teece. Only an economist that's never read beyond the textbooks would put that out as the optimization rule. Although firms that optimize may end up setting marginal revenue equal to marginal cost. But here's what Eric Ries said. In real life, a lot is happening simultaneously. Acquiring new customers and serving existing ones, raising capital, building capabilities, trying to improve the product, improving operations, deciding if and when to pivot. That's what building an enterprise is about. It's about doing all of this stuff simultaneously. So it's not just about being ambidextrous, it's about being multidextrous, would you not say? At least that's what Eric Ries is saying. Although ambidextrous, I suppose, can be about more than doing two things at once, but he's quite right to point out, and that have been in a startup know this is true. There's all kinds of things that are being worked on simultaneously, and there's a need to coordinate and cooperate, and it's often incredibly chaotic. The very essence of a startup is chaos, but hopefully it's managed chaos and not complete chaos. So what's wrong with this framework? Well, nothing necessarily, but I would point out that startup is only one part of building an enterprise. Professor O'Reilly would agree with that, and probably Eric Ries would as well. They're not explicit about why you need this, but I think we can be explicit in the dynamic capabilities framework and say, it's because of deep uncertainty, silly. Because of unknown unknowns, you can't plan, and you have to, essentially learn. And how do you learn? You learn by doing, and then you learn from your mistakes, you learn from new information, you learn from customers you don't win, you learn from customers you do win, and you keep modifying the strategy. You keep pivoting until you get the business model right, until you get the strategy right, until you get the operations right. It's about continuous experimentation. He doesn't tell you anything about mechanisms for sensing and seizing. He tells you should listen to the customer. Well, that's good advice, but is it just the customer you should listen to? What do you have to be watching in terms of what the competitors are doing? Do you have to listen to the competitors as well? According to Jeff Bezos, you don't. You just focus entirely on the customer. So Jeff Bezos would endorse this. Listen to the customer. Stupid. That's all you have to do is listen to the customer. Don't worry about strategy. Don't worry about competition. So there we go on Lean Startup. So let me pause now. We've got Clay Christensen's model out there in brief form. And we've shown that it's largely compatible with dynamic capabilities. We've got the Lean Startup model out there. We show that's more or less compatible with dynamic capabilities. Any comments? First of all, has anyone here read Eric Ries's book before they took the class? Not in the context of the classroom, but it's a very popular book. Has anyone either read the book or listened to one of the many, many YouTube presentations by Eric Ries? He's a fantastic and very articulate speaker. I'd be surprised if we don't have somebody who knows Eric or has heard him. Do we? Andrew?
I'll caveat with I read his book maybe 7 years ago, so it's not the freshest. But I think my biggest takeaway was basically they would think of these ideas of products to create and then watched how their customers used them and interpreted the value proposition from that, and then pivot to that as kind of the core or center of the offering they wanted to work on, and then iterate on that over time.
Yeah, and it's very much thinking that IDEO and the design thinking crowd have been presenting and pushing for a long period of time. So, but it's a very old idea that you got to get close to the customer. The only reason why it's novel is because what happens in big organizations, you get remote from the customer. Management gets remote from the customer. So the only reason we're talking about it is it's not new science. It's a property of large organizations that management becomes remote, and then the rest of the organization becomes remote, and the people on the front line are not remote, but the problem of information flow back to management gets harder and harder the more successful you become. So it's only when you're successful that suddenly listening to the customer becomes a new idea. I didn't learn, my father was an entrepreneur at age 18 and built businesses, never taught me anything, but I do remember him saying one thing once, which is the customer's always right. And, that's very much Jeff Bezos. If you've got Amazon Prime, if you're not an Amazon Prime, maybe the customer's not always right, but with Amazon Prime, the customer is always right. And if you start with that attitude, you're halfway towards buying into lean startup, and you got your toe in the water with respect to dynamic capabilities as well. The first business book ever to break 1 million copies was a book that came out in the 70s called In Search of Excellence by Tom Peters and by Peters and Waterman, two ex-McKinsey consultants. One was a McKinsey consultant, which was Waterman, and Peters left McKinsey. He made a fortune out of this book. There's a whole chapter in that book on listening to the customer. And, I always read it with profound puzzlement. Why do you have to put a chapter on, paying attention to the customer? Isn't that what business is about? And of course, I recognize sooner or later that yes, it is what business is about. But if you have large, successful organizations, it's actually quite hard for customer feedback to get to the right place and to be acted upon. Any other comments? John Eastman, any connection to Eastman Kodak, by the way?
Connection. Not sure if that'd be a good thing or a bad thing, though, based on his class.
No, it was a great name in science and photography. So, are you?
I have a quick question, Professor.
Please.
We've discussed a lot of examples where bigger companies tried the lean startup and failed miserably. But do you also see any companies out there that are, decently big in size that have actually tried this and have succeeded, as a transformation to lean startup, maybe?
Sorry, I didn't quite hear that, Ian. Can you repeat that? Have I seen big companies that use lean startup successfully? Was that the question?
Yes, correct.
Great, thanks.
I've got a relationship with a company in China called Haier, H-A-I-E-R, and they're now the largest white goods manufacturer in the world, and they bought GE. They bought GE's home appliance division, which gave them a big footprint in the United States. And they have what they call a micro enterprise model, where the organizational units are very, very small relative to the size of the company. And when you look at what these micro enterprise units do, it's very much close to a lean startup model. They love to talk about how they came up with a new type of dishwasher. I forget what it was, but they, discovered that farmers in China were washing their potatoes in the in the washing machine or something like that, and so they realized from that, there's a chance here to build a specialized product that will actually wash potatoes, and they did. But the story about kind of close engagement with customers and listening to customers, there's many big companies that do it quite well, but they generally get there by creating pretty small organizational units. 3M, another classic case, it's done that with small organizational units. So yeah, I think there are some cases of big companies doing it. And of course, in the age of big data, it's a lot easier. You can now learn who's buying your product. You can learn much quicker who's buying your product, and you can also, sometimes figure out who reviewed your product, or who reviewed your product, actually reviewed or viewed your product and didn't buy. So there's a lot more customer information out there, and that's why the big tech company, that's why Amazon is so successful. It's getting all of this customer feedback, and got the algorithms to analyze it and to bring about immediate changes in the way they present and price and market their products. So yes, I think Amazon's success is very much because they're doing this incredibly well. Anyone else have a view on that? Gopal, are you there? Dan, are you there?
Quick comment. Andreessen Horowitz just had a podcast this week. I think I can't remember the two guys' names, but they interviewed two former Amazon execs that actually criticized Lean Startup, and they gave AWS as an example. I think somebody in here works for AWS, so I don't know if this is fully accurate, but what they were saying is that Lean Startup focuses too much on moving fast, moving quickly, and they spend a lot more time planning and thinking about the business design. And I think the stat they used was they spent it was either 12 or 18 months just planning and designing the strategy for AWS before they actually started writing code or launching. I thought it was an interesting discussion.
That's a good point. In fact, Professor O'Reilly mentioned that, but AWS they did at least have a low-cost way. What I picked up from what O'Reilly said was they didn't spend a lot of money, maybe quite a bit of time on AWS, and then of course once they hit the go button, they did. But yeah, look, please, if you see references to that, I'd love to have it. Clearly, if you're Boeing, I don't think the lean startup idea works very well. You're not going to start building an airplane and then change midway, or if you're, even if you're Tesla, I'm not sure you want to change midstream. And maybe in SpaceX you can reconfigure the system. If it fails, you reconfigure fairly quickly because you're dealing with single moonshots, so to speak, or single launches. But if you're in mass production world, it's hard to pivot. At least once you're in a mass production, it's very, very hard and expensive to pivot. So it comes back to that quote earlier on about Bezos saying that, look, there's certain things that you can adapt once you're in them, and there's certain things you can't, and that you need to discriminate between those that you can adapt and those that you can't. And the way you spend money, you're going to have to do a lot more planning if it's an irreversible type investment. Any other comments?
Yeah, one thought I'll add as well is I feel like, and I felt this way when I read Lean Startup a few years ago, and especially now that I work for a regulated company, I feel that Lean Startup does not work as well in regulated industries. I work for Standard & Poor's, and we obviously have our ratings division as well as others, and I struggle to see how something like Lean Startup, where you're moving quickly and breaking things, works when there's a significant amount of government regulation around your products.
Yeah, you're not going to launch a new vaccine with Lean Startup, are you? When you got an FDA regulatory process to go through, even if it's even if it's put on turbocharger, you're quite right, and you don't have that. If you need the regulator to tick the box or check the box on whatever you're doing, that's going to put a crimp on it. Now, I think that's a very good observation. regulated industries go to the beat of the regulator, basically. So, but let's take healthcare, which is highly regulated and there's a lot of reimbursement and insurance and so forth. I could still see that there's ways that you could follow this methodology towards discovering new business models, particularly with digital transformation. All right, well, I don't think we're going to talk about this one. Strategy needs strategy. See if we can move on to something a bit more. Yeah, come back to where we were and where I thought I would start the class, but because Professor O'Reilly showed up, we didn't. But remember, at the end of the last class, we're talking about open innovation and dynamic capabilities. So let's kind of just close the loop on open innovation. You now know what it is. You know, it's another great idea out of the Haas School, Henry Chesbrough, and it's about managing the inflows and outflows of knowledge. Why do we need open innovation? Because there's always going to be more knowledge on the outside than you can ever get your hands around internally through your own R&D. So knowledge dispersion means there's a lot of good ideas out there and there's a lot of new technology that you can reach for and capture. And you need to do so quickly. And that means you must, in many cases, go outside. It's sad to say, but sometimes easier to get something from the outside than from the inside. But you've also got intellectual property issues to deal with. You can't just take anything from the public domain. It's only that which is truly in the public domain and not protected by property rights that's available to you. So our bottom line here is that because of stronger global competition, you don't have time to do everything in-house. You don't have the resources to do everything in-house. And you've got to be scouring the world, including the places like increasingly as China ramps up its research and development, American companies and European companies got to be good at scouring ideas out of China too. Very different system, but there's knowledge there. There's knowledge that's being generated. China will soon be spending more on research and development than the United States. It's not quite at that point yet, but it's certainly going to get there in the next decade or so. So any U.S. company or European company or Japanese company has got to be aware of what's happening in China, or at least can benefit from being aware about what's happening in China. So our view here is that sensing, of course, is very much about open innovation. So it enhances dynamic capabilities. So that's just a recap of where we were. This one I'm going to drop. But I'm going to now turn to the other concept I introduced you before, which is another Berkeley product, Jiro Nanaka, PhD in marketing from Berkeley in the 60s, now the most distinguished management professor in Japan at Hitotsubashi University. He's emeritus. But he actually probably, you heard Professor O'Reilly say that Lead and Disrupt sold 50,000 copies in China, in Japan. The only other book that's sold something like that has been a Nanaka book. So Nanaka and O'Reilly are the two most acclaimed business authors that have captured the imagination of Japanese executives. And the knowledge creation idea is one that Nanaka used. It's about 10, 15 years old now. Basic idea is that organizations create knowledge through action and interaction. So it's this sort of dialectic. Nanaka's son is very philosophical, so he tends to have ideas from philosophy that permeate his thinking, which will make it easy for those of you that understand philosophy, and those of you that are more pragmatic will find it somewhat esoteric. But he can speak in plain English, despite the fact that Japanese is his native language. And as he points out, the organization interacts with its environment and reshapes the environment, even itself, through the process of knowledge creation. So the idea of reshaping the environment is very much an entrepreneurial idea, very much a dynamic capabilities concept. and it's through the interaction with the environment, through learning, that knowledge gets created. And he actually does embrace dynamic capabilities by saying the most important aspect is the dynamic capability to create new knowledge and existing firm-specific capabilities. I didn't tell him to write that. He wrote it by himself. So he's seeing some commonality there. So here is his process. Let me put up the various elements of his process, which he calls SECI. S for socialization. So first of all, and this has got significant COVID implications, tacit knowledge is acquired through shared experiences. Obviously, face-to-face is a very important part of Japanese culture, and sharing and team is a very important part of Japanese way of doing things. And socialization is therefore part of knowledge creation to him. But it's not just creating knowledge and getting ideas, it's then becoming explicit. It's about writing it all down, whether it be in formula or whether it be in language. But externalization, he calls this process externalization, kind of a clumsy word. But I suppose, if tacit knowledge lies inside, then if you write it down, you can certainly make it easier to transmit. In that sense, it becomes external. Anyway, it's his choice of words, not mine. But then once it's written down, then you can mix it up. This is sort of a remix idea, the process of converting explicit knowledge into something more complex and systematic. So it's very much like elements of knowledge are complementary. You put it all in the washing machine, and not in the washing machine, but and you put it all in a tumbler and mix it all up, and that's part of the process of learning and innovation. But then at the end of the day, you take this explicit knowledge and it turns back into tacit knowledge again. So knowledge goes from tacit to explicit, then back to tacit again at the end of this cycle. And it all happens in what he calls, this Japanese word, ba, or common space. It leads to shared experience, which undergird his knowledge-creating spiral. I find this a little esoteric and abstract. I think Japanese people, I know we have one of them in the class, so you'll have to help me here, must enjoy this philosophical bent, and even executive, because this stuff has gone big in Japanese business. Not just in the academic world, but in Japanese business. They've latched on to a lot of these ideas, and there must be a much more philosophical bent to the practical people in Japan. But here it is in a nutshell. This is his knowledge spiral. Socialization, people mix up together, they then write knowledge down, that's the externalization. They then mix it all up. Schumpeter always talked about innovation as being new combinations. And so you create knowledge this way, and then you internalize it, and it becomes tacit again. And he uses example after example of innovations in Japan. Honda with one of the new models of cars that he studied, and Toshiba with a miniature, bread maker. There's all kinds of examples that he has of products that get developed this way. And I don't know what to make of it. And actually, I would appreciate the help of the class in trying to figure this out. But I think it's somewhat consistent with dynamic capabilities. Certainly the idea of combination is consistent with dynamic capabilities. The notion of socialization or reaching out and engaging with customers or employees, all of that's sort of compatible. And I would love to understand how to tie this together better, because I promised Nanaka-san that we'd write something about how these frameworks fitted together. And so, yes, what a wonderful assignment it would make for somebody, or some of you in class, if you're so inclined, to take these ideas and see what you can do with them. I think it enhances dynamic capabilities. It implicitly employs abductive reasoning, and it enmeshes sensing and seizing and so forth. So that's the Seki process. See, anyone want to say anything about that? I know it's very much a thumbnail sketch, but the book itself is a quick read. It would only take you an evening if you're a really fast reader. It would take you a week if you're not. Does anyone have, first of all, has anyone encountered this idea before, the Seki process, the knowledge creating company? There's dozens of HBR articles on it. It's gotten a lot of attention. You're probably a little tired, so let me just go on to do one more thing. There's a beautiful little paperback by John Kay, who is a strategy professor, was a strategy professor at the London Business School. Actually, not at the London Business School, sorry, at Oxford University. He was the dean of the business school, the Said Business School, the founding dean of the Said Business School in Oxford. He's a brilliant Scotsman and a very thoughtful economist. He wrote this little book called Obliquity, which is really about strategy. And it says basically that the way you get things done, not just in life, but in business, is to go about things obliquely, which is not quite indirectly, but it's not necessarily, head on. So let's look at the second bullet point there. How do you maximize profits? Milton Friedman says that the way to riches is to maximize profits. But most companies that try to maximize profits do end up doing just the opposite. Why? Because it forces you, it doesn't force you, but if companies start out with a view of maximizing profits, they tend to almost be too short run about it, and they destroy value. So, Chainsaw Al with his mergers, ended up destroying value left, right, and center. He uses the example of many British companies that once they started maximizing profits, they were gone within a decade. So there's this paradox, and I believe this is true. I do believe the way, the Berkeley Research Group, I never get up in the morning and think about how to maximize profits. I get up in the morning thinking about how to make the company better, because I know in the long run, that's going to make it more robust, more viable, and more profitable. But you don't start with the goal of making profits, and don't start with the goal, unless you're in distress. If you're in distress, and if you don't, get to break even in a quarter, you're out of cash, then yes, you better focus on maximizing profits or some short-term goals. But the way to achieve, do you think Jeff Bezos started out wanting to maximize profits? I don't think so. Did Steve Jobs set out trying to maximize profits? I don't think so. He set out, if you listen to his graduation speech at Stanford, he wanted to make a small dent in the universe. You think Elon Musk is trying to maximize profits? No, but I think he's become the wealthiest guy in the world now. He's not trying to maximize profits. He's trying to get to Mars and trying to do a lot of other good things along the way. And clearly he's focused on bottom line performance, but he's focused on the bottom line just to earn the resources to get the license to do what he wants to do. So you don't maximize profits by maximizing profits. That's John Kay's point, and he is precisely correct. Why is that so? And we'll look at his third point there. Direct approaches require us to know the method of solution before we start. So yes, if there's no uncertainty, you can maximize profits because you can figure out the solution before you start. But if there's deep uncertainty, how the hell do you go out to maximize profits other than by doing the right thing? So the second to last bullet point there, the world is too complex for directness to work. This is really profound stuff. I'm not just giving you this guy is a serious heavyweight thinker. You can just put this in your pocket for the rest of your life and have nothing else in your back pocket, and you'll be successful as a business person, in my view. This is really deep, serious stuff. It's 2 levels, 3 levels deeper than Clay Christensen. Directness only works when the world is stable. Deep uncertainty requires obliquity. That's my translation of what he's trying to say. But I remember picking the book up at first and thinking it's pretty light, but the more I think about it, it's actually very deep. And the reason, he doesn't tell you why obliquity, I'm trying to spill content into this here. He doesn't quite tell you why obliquity is important, but I'm trying to tell it to you because most of these bullet points here are my own comments. Some of them are his, but some of them are mine. I'm trying to make sense of his statement because there definitely are companies, many examples of companies that set out trying to maximize profits and they do the opposite. Which, just think if you put the CFO in charge, you make the CFO the CEO, putting aside the Intel story, you're not going to maximize profits. You're going to probably destroy value. Any comments on this? I think that's the last slide I have on John Kay. So he's also one of my good friends, I should point out. So let's have a bit of discussion on this. This is too profound of stuff to hit the button and move on. Let me put it to you. I mean, Milton Friedman became famous where he said the business of business is to maximize profits. And this is all over the Financial Times. It's the 30th anniversary of Friedman, the Nobel laureate economist, saying this. It was all over the Financial Times, all over the Wall Street Journal. And what we're talking about here goes to the very, very essence of business. And, of course, the ESG crowd says, no, Friedman got it completely wrong. And I think it's a very complicated question, not a question whether Friedman's right. Of course, he's partially right. If you don't pay attention in the long term to profits, you'll fail as business. But at the same time, if your primary and visceral focus is profitability and not building a viable enterprise, you're not going to maximize profits. And this is hard for economists because economists don't know how to think about an organization other than as a business organization facing competition. They just assume the job is to maximize profits. And John Kay isn't saying don't maximize profits. He's saying don't have maximization of profits as a goal. Direct approaches require us to know the method of solution before we start. If you don't know the method of solution, then you can't have maximize profits as your goal. You'll never get there. You'll, in fact, shoot yourself in the foot. everyone's probably tired because you had to grind through that exam. But has anyone got anything they want to say about this, what appears to be a simple idea of obliquity? And by the way, it's generalizable outside of business. I mean, the notion, the closest, if you want to get from A to B, you don't necessarily take the most direct approach. It depends on traffic, right? You sometimes go across the other side of town and you travel further depending on the traffic. So it's not like this is rocket science, but no one speaks about this in a business context. But they should, because clearly under deep uncertainty, the direct approach is often the wrong approach. And the reason we're talking about it is because uncertainty is getting ratcheted up and up and up, yet our mental models come from yesterday, where the direct approach seemed like perfectly obvious, straightforward thing to do. And anyone who didn't go directly towards trying to maximize profits was clearly leaving money on the table. And what John Kay is saying is, no, you won't be leaving money on the table. You will, in fact, that is the way in which you will eventually be most successful. And you see these examples all around us. I don't think I've seen the word profit come out of Elon Musk's mouth once. I haven't heard him talk about profitability. It'd be a good thing to do a textual search on what he says. And also, likewise, with Bezos. Someone should look at where we should, Ian, we should do some textual analysis of their public statements, and even on earnings calls. Probably just talk about profit on earnings calls that the analysts are asking about it all the time. Someone was trying to ask a question.
And Rachel, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, thanks. This is more of just a comment than a question. That what you said about you don't maximize profits by maximizing profits really resonates with me. Like just thinking out so many examples of, Amazon, as you said, thinking about Uber, Lyft, like so many other startups that have not emphasized profits. It just, I think it's really saliently describing what we've observed in the market over the past few years. And in my own work, I've observed this tension sometimes, especially working with, maybe people who are in engineering or data science, saying if we make these like tweaks to our algorithm, we can, reduce customer benefit by 1% and then increase profits by 0.5%, or these kinds of trade-offs that are very profit driven. It's hard to describe why that's not good sometimes. And I feel like this framework of innovation and dynamic capabilities is really helpful to explain that to them.
Oh, thank you, Rachel, for those comments. So you're exactly right, and it's one of the hardest things to do, because sometimes when the uncertainty disappears, then yeah, it's okay to focus on, okay, how do I, notch up profits a little bit? But the minute you're back into deep uncertainty, there's too many variables out there. And if you focus on immediately on the bottom line, you're probably ignoring something important. No one's really unpacked what's underneath this sort of profound statement, but you're right. You observe out there that companies that try to maximize profits usually end up doing the opposite. I would say that it depends a lot on the industry and the circumstance, but increasingly it's true that it no longer works. And there's largely a rejection. The people that reject the Friedman mantra usually reject it because they say, oh, you have to pay attention to society's needs and all these things. But that's only a piece of it. Yes, you have to pay attention to society's needs to earn the respect of people so they'll buy your product and they'll want to work for you. But at the same time, it's not just earning respect from and treating other constituents well and treating all stakeholders well. it's also about how you manage under uncertainty. You can't use such simple rules. So it's actually back to Kathy Eisenhart, my critique of Kathy Eisenhart. Certainly, maximizing profits is the simplest of all rules, but probably the least applicable one. All right, well, look, thank you very much, all of you. I burnt you out. There's so much to chew on here. What are we covering? Well, we'll just pick up from this point next class. Ian, did we assign readings for the next class? I think we did.
Yes, yeah, they'll be posted shortly on B courses.
Okay, all right, and we got office hours. So look, from now on, I want the class to go to the beat of a different drummer. You know, you've done the hard yards now. You're into these concepts, and hopefully these mental models are now part of you. And now I want to have more engagement with you, both, you know, here online. I'm going to try and organize, for those of you that are local, I'm going to organize a boat trip or something like that, or got office hours. I really want to try and engage you in a more casual and an informal way around these ideas, because you've done the work now for the midterm. We're getting through all of these related paradigms, and now it's where the rubber meets the road with real business decisions that you're living every day. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.